So I want to introduce Rick and why I thought he would be a good fit, for this week. And Flight of the Concords. There you go. Hysterical. If anybody hasn't seen that, it's one of the funniest, craziest, weirdest shows. I don't know, it's HBO or something like that. I don't know, HBO or Showtime, but Rick and I were talking about community, about how do you build a community. It's, to me, the level that gets you to the point where financially you develop a lot of security. Because if you do it really well, those are the people that you connect with around shared values, shared mission. And if you add enough value, that's where your customers are going to come from. And they're going to be people you want to work with anyways, because you've developed these relationships, and they're going to work with each other. They're going to help each other. And that's just been so powerful. And Rick has successfully done that. So much of it to me is, doing a lot for free and always having a big free component, and then layering on other levels. And he can talk about his approach, which is a little different than that. But, many of us, I think all of us need some kind of a show, a podcast, somewhere to put out our intellectual capital, for credibility, for our market point of view approach. But most people give up after a couple of months because nothing happens. And Rick, has a story around why he did it in the first place. And then he actually figured out how to make it work and monetize not just the audience of the podcast, but created a business off the people coming into the podcast, right? So I want to turn it over to you, and why don't you just, and anybody who has questions or comments, throw them in the chat. Rick, I'll monitor the chat, so you don't have to do that. And then just sort of bring in the questions when you're ready.
Okay. Well, thank you, Larry, for the opportunity. I have a couple slides that give us some context. Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
All right, I'll do that. So using Zoom now for over a year, being more proficient than when we started in this model. I assume you all see the screen, and it says $1 million podcaster. Yes?
Yep.
All right, well, let's rock and roll. So it's great to be around a bunch of entrepreneurs who are climbing the mountain. And I am going to talk about how I've turned a podcast into not only a revenue generator for my business, consistent revenue generator, but also the brand positioning that it allowed me to create a community here in Orange County, California. So let's rock and roll. Confucius said, "It does not matter how slowly you go, so long as you do not stop." I like this quote and I like this graphic. And when I was thinking about today's talk, I thought, boy, given the branding that Larry has given to this group and the way you maybe view yourself as climbers, this seemed to be an appropriate way to get started. I'm a sucker for motivational quotes. And whenever I give this talk, I always kick it off with a quote. Here's what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you. I'll give you a little bit of background, a couple slides. We'll talk about the challenge that I faced at a point in my career. I don't know about you as entrepreneurs, but it's a journey. And there are times when it isn't as positive feeling as others. So I want to give you that context for what happened with the journey for the podcast, then the outcome, and share a couple lessons learned, what I think are best practices, and then open it up for hopefully a discussion and any Q&A that you might have. Just some background on me. I'm 63 years old. I'm an entrepreneur. And as I said, I'm currently, and have been since 2007, a partner with Renaissance Executive Forums. They are a global organization with 2,000 CEOs and business owners. And I am the business partner running the Orange County market. What's that mean? I chair peer groups, monthly, half-day, roundtable, confidential settings for entrepreneurs and business owners. I've authored 3 books over the time. We'll talk about one of them in particular, maybe 2. They really helped to build my thought leadership. I had read a book early on about how to differentiate yourself as a service provider, and one of the suggestions was to write a book. And I thought, hey, I think I might be able to write a book, especially when I surveyed the market that I'm in, this peer group business, realizing that even though these have been around for a long time, peer groups, popularized by a company by the name of Vistage and from the 50s. But even before that, nobody had ever written a book about why people wanted to be in a peer group. So I thought that might be an opportunity. So that was my first of 3 books. And as Larry said, I've done this same thing, but called it different things. Radio show, podcast, now we call it a business talk show. And we're Orange County's longest running business talk show, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's Ric Franzi. When I left the corporate world, I had, in 2007, I'd been in a peer group as the president and general manager of a manufacturing company, and I had an epiphany one day. I think I'd rather do with the guy, Bob Grable, who's leading this peer group, than what I'm doing. We were at a beautiful retreat in Santa Barbara. Rather than running the company, I had sort of achieved all that I wanted to do in the corporate world, which was kind of get to be the boss. And I had done that for 7 years. And I thought, there's got to be something else. I was 49 years old at that time. And I decided to get into this industry, which was helping other entrepreneurs and business owners to scale and grow their business. I had no experience as an entrepreneur, let alone a startup. You know, all my time was with corporate companies and Fortune 500s. And I honestly thought that I could replace my earnings in 2 years because I was just that good, frankly. I was earning, $250,000 a year, that kind of income. And I have a family, a wife. I had 2 teenage children at the time who were prepping to go to college. Not when your financial advisor might suggest that you give up the day job to start to be an entrepreneur. But I had this burning desire to do this. I always wanted to be an entrepreneur. When my wife and I got married in 1986, we were on our honeymoon and we were sort of writing out our life plan. And I remember distinctly part of my contribution to that was that someday I wanted to own my own business. Didn't know what that business would be, but I knew that someday I wanted to be in business for myself. And I was really aggressive at the beginning. I came from a sales and marketing background, so I was willing to overinvest because I bought a franchise, frankly, because I wanted to be on my own, but I didn't want to be alone. And they had a model that they said would scale my business. And so I thought, well, I can, I'm that good that I'm going to double the investment and grow twice as fast. And like I said, replace my corporate income even more quickly. And as many of you might know, I didn't know what I didn't know about being an entrepreneur and running a startup. But I thought by the end of my second year, I'd be on a run rate to be back to the corporate earnings of $250,000 a year. And then reality set in. This is my Excel spreadsheet of my profit and loss statement for the first 2 years. You can see the revenue, you can see the expense. I didn't know the Great Recession was coming, frankly, ladies and gentlemen. I left the corporate world 2007, early 2008, and you might remember if you were in business in those days, the world was different. And in that 2007 expense, because this was kind of 2007, I had $42,000 that I had to pay to the franchisee. So that sat on my balance sheet. That didn't really sit in my income statement because it was we were amortizing those education costs and fees. But still, it was cash that I had to pay. So after 2 years, rather than recovering my corporate earnings, I had a net loss in my business of almost the same amount, $215,000, which was staggering, frankly, to us personally and financially. So as I said, the moment of truth came for me when I depleted our family savings. I was using our home equity line of credit for cash flow. Not a good thing to do, but we had equity in the house because we had lived there since 1994. And I remember sitting in our formal living room, opening the mail one day, and there was a letter from Wells Fargo Bank informing me that they were capping my home equity line of credit at my current balance. And that dried up my cash flow, frankly. I could no longer borrow against my house's equity. And what I had realized is the new client acquisition model that the franchisor had sold me on, given the constraints of what was going on in the business world, wasn't getting me the clients as fast that I wanted. And the expense, the front end marketing expense to get in front of people to talk about my business proposition was just too costly, especially now that I had been significantly constrained from a cash flow perspective. And I had the realization that I had to figure out what to do before I went bankrupt. Cortez, I burned the ships. When I left the corporate world, I made a commitment to myself that I wouldn't look back, that I wouldn't take the phone calls or the emails about a job, and I wouldn't apply for jobs, even in the darkest time. So I never allowed myself that opportunity to look over my shoulder to see if I might be able to get back into getting a paycheck, because I thought that would undermine everything that I believed I was working for. So I refused to do that. But I was, frankly, in a desperate situation, kind of feeling like a failure. Having succeeded for most of my career on the whole, this was a very humbling experience for me to go from a successful corporate career to being almost a bankrupt entrepreneur. So what happened next? This is the first journey, the first step on the journey. This is the book that I was talking about before. It's called Critical Mass, The 10 Explosive Powers of CEO Peer Groups. It was written based on my experience as a member of a peer group, why business owners, executives, and entrepreneurs want to get around each other for a half a day or some period of time, once a month, to kind of, Michael Gerber says, work on their business rather than in their business all the time. And when that book came out, I hired a public relations firm to help me launch this book. And one of the places that they got me an interview was with this lady. Her name is Deborah Sweet, and she was doing a podcast called The Power of Leadership Radio. She's out of San Diego, and she had me as one of 3 guests on her show on February the 3rd. The book came out in January, late January and February. My public relations firm, this is one of the exposure gets they got for me, was this interview with her. And I was excited to talk about my book. I never met her. We did it over the phone. And when it was over, I felt like I really wanted to do something nice for her, because I appreciated the fact that she gave me a chance to talk about my book. And so when I hung up that phone and I had this compelling desire to help her in some way, I thought, I would like people to feel that way about me in my market. This theory of reciprocity, Robert Cialdini in his book, The Science of Influence, talks about multiple ways of influencing people, and reciprocity is one of them. And I thought, how do I use reciprocity here in my market to get the same feeling with prospects and other people in the business? When I went to college at the University of Pittsburgh, I actually went to school thinking that I was going to be in radio. I wanted to be a disc jockey, and so all through college, I did radio shows, interviews, and whatever it took just to be on the radio station. And so this idea of doing a podcast, or radio show as we called it back in those days, I was very comfortable with it because I had done something similar previously. And so this was on February 3rd. I got together with my then business partner and my public relations firm, and we made this press release 11 days later. And this is one of the great things about being an entrepreneur, ladies and gentlemen, in my opinion. The time between when you have a good idea that you think can make your business better and you can implement it can be as short as your commitment to getting it done, which I think is fantastic. I didn't have to go through layers of executives to get approval. I didn't have a whole management team that I had to get on board. It was basically my business partner and I realizing that if we could announce a radio show, we called it a radio show at that time because in 2009, podcasts weren't a thing as much as they are today, frankly. We found an online radio show format called LA Talk Radio, and we would buy time from them from 4 to 5 p.m. every Monday afternoon and interview people and then stream it, and then turn it into a podcast and put it up. And it was the way we decided to do that. So 11 days later, we announced that we were going to have that radio show. And that was the next step in my journey. So here we are now, 12 years later.
You are listening to the Critical Mass Radio Show, Orange County's business talk show, focused on exploring topics of interest to CEOs who are leading middle market companies. With your host, Ric Franzi.
I've been using that intro and I have a complimentary outro for years, frankly. I hired a lady off of Fiverr for very little. She created what I think is a professional sounding intro. We now call it the business talk show, and I'll get to that in a minute. But over those 12 years, we've done 1,300 podcasts. I've interviewed 1,600 people. They're all available in my archives for people to listen to and learn. And people are still listening to older shows out of the catalog, which is great. Hundreds of thousands of downloads. Now let's get to the part why Larry, I think, invited me to be here. One of the reasons is from the very beginning of the radio show, the focus has always been to get the relationship with the guest, because people buy from people who they know, like, and trust. And this was an opportunity to have people talk about themselves, hopefully in an interesting format. And I got to know people through what you might call a Trojan horse, but it's an opportunity to give them something of perceived value, which was the opportunity to share their story about being an entrepreneur and a successful business owner. And I've recruited 63 of my clients through the radio show. Most 2/3 of those are direct CEOs and business owners who became members of my community. And then the other third are people that worked for those CEOs and business owners who they referred me into and said, well, maybe here I have a key executive that could be in one of your groups. So about 3% of the total interviews turned into revenue. I've generated over $1 million in revenue from these guests. And for 4 years, we were averaging over $100,000 in revenue per year, because my business model is the peer groups where we enroll a member and they stay for several years with me. Some of them, I've had members since 2007. And so they'll stay an average of 4 or 5 years with me. So once I get them, the revenue stream sets up pretty nicely. 2019, we had 111,000. The COVID has kind of set me back a little bit. Last year, I was about 85,000 from these members. I expect this year to be about the same amount, 80-some thousand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the unintended consequences of doing this radio show is that I wrote a book based on it. You might have heard of the concept of blog to book. Like if you want to write a book, it's easier to write it in chunks. So do a blog and do around consistent themes and then aggregate those blogs into a book. That's an easier way to do it. We did a podcast, the book, where I started asking a consistent question of my guests about their guiding principle. And we then edited those responses and turned them into a book. This is the 3rd generation of the book. What did it do for me? It helped build even another community, which was a subset of all the radio show guests. It's the 150 or so people that we chose to feature their interview. We had a book launching for the first release of this book. We had them come, we had a wine and cheese party and gave every author a copy of their book. And it just allowed me again through reciprocity to continue to build what I thought was valuable relationships with these people. What also happened, but I didn't anticipate, is a number of my guests liked the experience and saw the business model enough that they've started their own shows. So here are 6 of them who are now in the market doing their own version of a podcast in different areas of business, but really decided it was a good idea to give it a try because of their experience with me on Critical Mass. So, sorry. One of the things that Larry wanted me to talk about was my community. And in the center, what you see there is a picture of an event that I hold at least twice a year before COVID. And we're going to be doing it again, actually in 2 weeks, first time since 2019, December of 2019. And that's an in-room event where those clients that I talked about that I have recruited and radio show guests and people that I've met come together, and we have a morning of learning and sharing and growing. And these are just some pictures to kind of show the community that we've built there. Lessons learned, best practices. If you're going to start a podcast or if you're doing one right now, what have I learned? Find your niche. There's so many podcasts now that are out there. And actually for a while, I was wondering if my radio show that I'd been doing consistently all those years was still as valuable as I perceived it to be. And because there were so many others, it wasn't as unique of an experience back in 2009, 10, 11. Offering someone to be interviewed on a podcast was not as prevalent as it is today. But I made the decision that for those of you that like college football, the Rose Bowl is considered the granddaddy of bowls. My podcast, which I now call a business talk show, is sort of the granddaddy of podcasts here in Orange County, California. No one has a catalog like I have, and I can continue to keep my first mover advantage by continuing to do the show in my niche. If you're going to be an interviewer, be a good one. There are a lot of bad podcasts out there, ladies and gentlemen. You have to study the craft of actually interviewing people. I joined the Los Angeles Press Club, and I attended events because I wanted to, in my mind, see myself as a radio show host. And so got a chance to meet Jane Fonda through that and a couple other celebrities because it's Los Angeles. But nonetheless, those were just fun things to do with my wife. But at the end of the day, being a member of the LA Press Club was the important part of that. If you're going to interview people on your podcast, which I would suggest is a good offer, have a curious mind. Listen to the guest answers. I don't know if hopefully you all listen to podcasts. It doesn't seem to me that some hosts actually hear what the guest is saying. They sort of have on their mind where they want to take the interview, and they may leave some really nuggets of good learning and sharing in the answer from the guest by moving on to the next question without maybe going a level deeper. It's important to remember the reasons that you're doing the show and stay true to that, and do the show whether you feel like it or not. Larry said earlier about, being consistent and persistent, and I agree with that. I have unfortunately seen many people come through excited about being a podcaster, and then for some reason they give up on it right before probably it's about to give them a return on their investment. And so to do that, find people that can help you so you don't burn out. I have a producer. My biggest marketing expense historically has been around the radio show, hiring college interns. There's still a lot of interns that are going to college for radio and broadcasting, and there aren't as many outlets for them. And so giving them the opportunity to be a producer on an online talk show is a great experience. One of my producers who started as an intern for me is now the morning news producer for the Los Angeles NBC affiliate, and that's second largest market, and she's got a big job. Another one is an online talent on an online service, and it's available on terrestrial radios, TV as well. Cheddar, she's doing the morning news business talk. And another one is a well-placed manager within a large company here called Glidewell Laboratories. So I've been able to get some really good interns to help me, and I could afford them, frankly, because they were college students. And if you use my business model, which is to know, like, and trust the guests and hopefully generate revenue, you have to get comfortable with what I call the pivot, which is going from hey, you've been a great guest, now let me tell you about what I do and see if you want to join my community. You need to work on that. I've seen a number of people who've tried this model who aren't comfortable moving from the gift that you've given them to the opportunity for them to maybe want to do business with you. And so that's why I say make the ask when they're under the ether. What I've learned over the years is as close to when they are feeling the enjoyment and the excitement and the feeling of reciprocity from when you've conducted the interview to when you make the ask is important. Like in the moment, right after the show is over. If you have a business model around this, it's really important to not wait very long, because the positive feeling of being a guest on your show dissipates pretty quickly, like overnight, next day kind of a thing. So you really have to be in the moment. And finally, control your ego. If you do this, if you're doing this and you're successful, make sure you're making business decisions, not ego decisions, because if you get any amount of traction in this type of a platform, you might find that you're being enticed by people who want to use your platform for their benefit, and it sounds good, but it's time away. It's an opportunity cost away from growing your business and losing focus on the reason why you're doing your show. So as we started, Confucius said, it does not matter how slowly you go, or so long as you do not stop. And that's where I'd kind of like to stop, though, and just open it up. I'll stop sharing and open it up for a conversation, Larry.
Okay, great. So I'll bring up Steve first, and then I think it'll be interesting after his question to go to some people that have experiences in this, and we can talk a little bit about it. Like everything else, there's different ways to do things, and you want to find your own way, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, give me a second here. I'm not a moderator. Whoever on my group, could you make me a moderator here? All right. Well, I'm not going to be able to do this. So Steve, why don't you just go to your, oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Perfect. Oops. What did I do? Picked the wrong person. All right. We did it right. Oh, the Steve Brody.
Well, while he's finding me, I'll just verbally
Yeah,
ask
go
that
for it.
question, Rick, and do that. So I overlapped your background a little bit. So you were with Renaissance. I was a Vistage chair. You
Sure.
know who Vistage is.
Yeah.
And for 20 years, I was in the Houston market. Still am in the Houston market. Left Vistage a couple of years ago. But all along, I've been a CEO coach in addition to my groups working with privately held companies in the middle market. So one of the things that recently I've been looking at, and Larry calls kind of an example of it, of meeting some other people, some efforts on LinkedIn to find people who have a platform like you, who have a platform and are looking for content. You're looking for knowledge experts or content, and you want to invite certain guests or experts to be on your podcast. So I'm curious to just understand the process with that. How do you go about it? How do you find people? If some of us might have an interest in appearing as a guest, appearing on someone's podcast, could you talk to a little bit about how you generate those for your shows?
Okay, if I could, I'll give. I hear two questions in that question. I'll be quick about each answer, and then if it's not satisfying, we can go deeper, Steve. The good news is there are so many podcasts that being a guest on the podcast can be pretty easy once you get the basics of what you're going to need to do. Here's what I believe, and don't hear this the wrong way. People are generally lazy, and you need to make it easy for them to make the decision you want them to make. And what does that mean when you want to be a guest on a podcast? You need to have a short, compelling, why should you be interviewed on this person's show? So you need to understand their focus of who their audience is and tailor your pitch to them, and then give them the questions they're going to ask you. Make it easy give them more questions than they have time to ask you, and let them feel like they've created the interview by choosing the subset of your 10 questions. So a good short pitch letter that talks about why you would be a good guest for their audience, and then give them the questions that they're going to ask you, so that if they pick you out of the lot, it's easier to be on your show. What I found is I have no trouble finding guests to be on the show. I actually have interviewed more authors than I care to talk about, because I'm on the publicist, and they send me the books and I choose the books that I want. And so finding guests once you're established is not difficult, because the other thing that I do is, if I have a good guest, is I ask them if they know someone, it's sales, know somebody who might be interested in being on the radio show. And if they do, would you mind introducing me? And so that's the two answers to the two questions, Steve. Be a good guest by doing all the work that you can for the host. And if you're going to do a podcast, just know that eventually there's a tipping point where you'll get more opportunities for people to interview than you have slots to interview them. But in the beginning, you're gotta fight for guests a little bit.
Good. Just if I could, just one kind of follow up to that, because you made a comment earlier about do your homework or be careful, meaning on the podcast side. You said there's a lot of bad ones, or maybe some that aren't as effective, but possibly meaning they don't have as big of an audience. So what would you suggest if I'm the person who has an interest in being on a podcast? How do I narrow down or screen what you were saying? There's a lot of bad ones and there's good ones. Is there any kind of model that you've seen that's an effective way of doing some of that screening for good podcasts?
the only suggestion I could make is first of all, you want a podcast that's in your niche, right? If you're a chef, then you want to be on the cooking shows, right? If you're an entrepreneur coaching CEOs, you want to be on podcasts that have an audience of those kind of people, CEOs, business owners, people who think of themselves as a CEO. And I would say listen to the show, because you can tell if you want to be interviewed by this person. Because why do you want to be on the podcast? Because you want to take the content and promote it in your own social media channels that you're a thought leader. And so you want the interview to be a good one because you hope people will listen to it. And even if you're the best guest, if you got a lousy host, you're not going to get a chance to get your message across. And some hosts don't really, well, a good host wants you to be successful.
Yeah.
So they'll prep you, they'll make sure you're ready, they get out of the way. A host that asks a question that is as long in time as you take to answer it is not a show you want to be on.
Right.
Because many times the podcaster is using that platform for themselves and they're obvious about it. Well, Steve, in my experience coaching CEOs, blah, 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 blah. Then I ask you your question. Meanwhile, I've had a chance as the host to position myself on top of you. And if, that's not what you want.
Sure. Good. Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay. George, you got a lot going on in this area too. So let's bring you up here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your presentation, Rick. And to your last point answering Steve, I just wanted to reinforce what you said, which is if you're going to look for guests on a podcast, find the target market that you want to be a player in. So you don't want to just be interviewing random people. And one of the things that Larry and I have talked about in the past was crossing the chasm, and also not as much inside the tornado. But in the book Inside the Tornado by Jeffrey Moore, what you're really looking for to get market penetration, you're looking for people that are leaders. I mean, big time leaders in the market segment that you want to be a player in yourself. And so what I've done, a couple of my first podcasts have included Jeffrey Moore, who's the author of those two books, Larry Walsh, who's a big time consultant in channel markets. I just yesterday scheduled a podcast with a guy by the name of Jay McBain, who is also nationally known consultant in channels with Forrester Group. And so what I hope to do is place myself alongside these absolute top tier thinkers, and then hopefully the doorbell will ring and I'll answer it for being right there alongside them. But the signal point here is referenceable people. So if nobody knows who you're interviewing, it's almost useless. If if everyone knows who you're interviewing and you're right there with them, that will make an impression.
So I'm going to respond to that, just because most of what you said I am in heated agreement with. But a finer point from my perspective, in my world, is it's good to have recognized names, because guests can tell their friends or acquaintances, hey, I'm going to be on with George. He's interviewed Jeffrey Moore, and that makes them feel like they're at the level of him. So from a emotional perspective, that's good for the guests. For me, what I found though, because my goal is the guest is the revenue engine, I'm not going to get any business from Jeffrey Moore. Unlikely he's going to become a member of my peer group. Now, I may get into his network a little bit, but probably not, because I'm just one of many podcasts and interviews he's going to be on. So I don't allocate a lot of my catalog to seminal names that people recognize, because it's an opportunity cost I've lost. I'd rather use my show to say, I've got another entrepreneur or business owner who could be a member of my community. Because at the end of the day, I'm using the radio show to drive my business membership.
Understood.
Got it. So David, you asked a question about finding um, finding high profile guests.
Yeah. So if you're just starting out in particular, how would you go about getting high profile guests, or do you like work your way up the chain and start with smaller ones, or how do you like elevate your guest level?
So that's a great question. So I find, again, my model is business owners, entrepreneurs running successful companies in Orange County. So I use LinkedIn and the local business journal. If you have a local business journal in your market, what I have found to be highly effective is after an article is written about some high flyer, I reach out to them and let them know that I saw the article in the Orange County Business Journal and I would like to go a little deeper with them in my podcast. Generally speaking, when the person gets an article written about them and then they get an opportunity to be interviewed, it sort of feels like to them they've gotten momentum on what they're trying to get done. And it's easier for them to say yes to you because they've just had some level of exposure. You don't have to limit it to your local market. If you see an article in a major publication, whether it be Entrepreneur Magazine or Smart Business or whatever you read, reaching out and having them realize why you're doing it is very complimentary to what, obviously, if they're being covered in the news and it's a positive story, they wanted that placement. If it's a negative story, they may not. But if it's a puff piece or something talking about how great they are, or the fact they just got $100 million next round investment, they want people to know that. And you're helping them get their message out.
Anything else, David?
No, that's it.
Okay. So Troy, you were talking about, I guess, kind of taking what you're doing that's already working and take it up to that next level. Was that your question?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious on timing. Like, how long did it take you to become what you consider established? And before you become established, did you create some kind of like funnel for an application so you can kind of vet the people that were going to be on the show on your podcast?
Okay, so so I started in 2009. It was a different world. When we'd reach out to people and say, "Hey, do you want to be on a show?" It wasn't like they were getting a lot of those opportunities presented to them. It was almost too easy. I mean, it went from having a very expensive customer acquisition model to, in the franchise system that I'm a part of with 30 plus business partners in North America, I had the lowest cost of getting in front of a prospect of anybody because very few people said no, right? Very few people said no. The key is, in my opinion, this is one man's opinion, one person, is it doesn't matter. You're not going to be Adam Carolla. Okay, we're not going to be. You might be Gary Vaynerchuk, but if you move your brand to try to go that way, it's such a hard slog. You want to be the biggest fish in your pond. What is your pond, and work in your pond? Because unless you're going to build and scale a national brand, what's really important in your brand is to be a player in your market. And so niche it down to the niche that is. Because what do I find? People want to listen to a show. They're lazy. They want to listen to a show that is most interesting to them. What's most interesting to them? Themselves.
Yeah.
People just like them. And while it feels a little repetitious because you're sort of in the same area, you can establish yourself much more quickly if you have a very clear niche that you're going after and the guests that you're wanting to interview. It also makes them more likely to want to be on your show because they probably know some of your other guests that you've gotten.
Yeah. So I had a weekly show before and it was just, I don't know how Larry does it. It's just too much work. So I have a monthly show, right? And so I could strategize around that. And so we had a couple events. A lot of, people have joined on that. So I call it the Troy Show. And I also had another strategy with the same name, and I'll do these meet and greets with interesting people. And they're showing me something new, like maybe it's a business idea or it's a concept I never thought about before, or it's a cool piece of software that helps you write blogs or whatever it is, right? And I'll say, oh, wait a minute, can I record this? Oh. And I will create videos, and it won't be on the main show, but I'll create videos for content with the branding of the show on it. So I think those things are pretty exciting. I was just curious on like the vetting process, because I'm not really thinking about getting a lot of guests. I'm thinking about getting a guest that it can be a partner. So the next show that's coming up, there's a couple of dominoes that came into effect, and one was talking to a business specialist that gave us some great ideas. I said, yeah, we should do that. And then with the guest person, he's in a similar field, but I don't consider that competition. I consider that partnership. And so the beginning of the show is always about LinkedIn and optimization or some kind of key element of that. But the tail end is something a little bit different. And for this month, it's like profile optimization. And then we're figuring out how to monetize that. I don't know how successful we're going to be, but it's pretty exciting because you got this new thing and you're providing value and that sort of thing. And it creates a life of its own, So would you suggest me to create some kind of handsome funnel so I can vet guests, or do you not suggest to do something like that for a very small show like mine?
I'm impressed that you have a clear focus on what you want to get done and the structure of the show. I don't know that you need to over manage the funnel of who's coming on your show as much as what's the arc of your show. In a year, where will your audience be where they aren't today? And what does the audience need to learn that you could find people who can share that knowledge? So I think it's good to be in the moment, and when people impress you, man, you got content and I'm going to share that. That's awesome. That's real world. That's street level. That's fantastic. And I think if you complement that with a theme of what you want to get people, where you want to move your
You're talking about the
audience.
repetition, that theme, that staple. Yeah. I've seen one other show right now that's monthly, and he has over 30,000 people. It's just like, what, but I look at it, it's like the same thing over and over again. So you're right,
Yeah. And again, this is one man's opinion. The too many people get impressed with how big a podcaster's audience is. What's more important in my mind is how engaged that audience is. Size matters in some things, not as much in podcasts, unless your ego says, I want tens of thousands of downloads. Okay, then go for that. But what's the ROI on that? The other side of it is, unless you're going to try to get advertisers, then they're looking for cost per million. They're looking for CPM. But that is that's a challenge.
That's a different game. Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense. I remember on my last show, I didn't cognitively think about engagement, and we realized we had too much content, and we had to cut the content literally by 60% to make it fit, because and then engage with the audience. And I think that's one thing that we could definitely improve on. So thank you.
All right, Mike, so you have a lot of experience in this too, and I saw your list of how to get guests. Do you have any questions or comments about what you know?
Can you hear me? I just said, this is great. I mean, this is really awesome, because a lot of the stuff he talks about, I have a similar story of I had events and meetings production company for years, and I had a weekly podcast for 10 years.
Nice.
And I stopped doing it 5 years ago. So it was and it was all about finding people in the industry to talk to. Everything he did sounds just kind of similar to what I did. And I like to say I bought a house from my podcast, because it was like it just built my network so big. It was great. But fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I'm actually learning stuff from this. Like, I should be doing a talk like this too. But anyway, the other thing was I did put a list of a bunch of stuff to get guests. There's like a whole bunch of ways you can get guests to get started anyway, and then find your niche of people. And the other thing I wanted to say about this too is, like, you hit the nail on the head about a niche, because I saw a guy talk, and he has a horse podcast network. And he has all these horse podcasts, and some of them have a gazillion downloads, but the one with the horse buggies, like people who have buggies behind their horse, he makes the most money from that podcast, and it has the least amount of listeners. So it's just kind of, you hit the nail on the head with all this stuff. And,
Yeah.
and the last thing I wanted to say was, I think the Revenue Climber has a good, one thing that I've been seeing people doing is they're teaming up for like an editor, like a bunch of people will get together and hire the same editor and all use that person, the same transcript person. And like, you can group together and hire somebody full time. And that's because podcasting is freaking hard. It's a slog to do, just like Troy was just saying. It's just like, it takes a lot of time. So getting those teams together is so helpful. So I didn't really ask a question. I apologize, but I was just like really liked the whole session. It was great. Thank you so much.
No, that's okay. My experience with this is I don't really think of this as a podcast. I think of it as a community event. But you could look at it certainly that way to analyze what works and what doesn't work. And for me, it's thinking about what will bring the community together and what will provide the most value. So I'm looking for people where it just strikes me they've done something useful and interesting that they can talk about. And that's it. I just think of it like that. And I bring them in, and we're booked a couple months ahead, which I think is really important. So I'm not scrambling around every week last minute. We were doing 3 guest events a week. No problems filling them up with the speakers. Now we're moving to just this being the main guest event, and then Wednesday's a workshop. And when we add the paid community element in September, the workshop will be sort of a separate thing. We're going to keep this as a free event for people who are not in the club, but still want to get value and be a part of it. But what we're going to do is we're going to move more to a podcast direction, because you got to build your audience first. And what we can do now is we're going to work in October on a strategy to go after the New York Times bestselling authors, the people who are known. So we are moving in that direction as well. And what you need, I think, and we're going to figure it out, is a content marketing strategy to draft off of their audience as well. So that's, I don't think, like we were talking about, there's a lot of different ways to do that. I didn't start there thinking of it like that. But we are moving in that direction. So Stephen, you obviously got a lot of experience in this too. I saw your comments.
Not a lot, and I don't do podcasting. I do video interviews. I've got a couple online TV channels or shows, I should say. But I was just saying that I had a conversation this morning with a lady from South Africa, and particularly with people I interview where English is their second or third language, they tend to ramble on, talk. So I like to prompt them ahead of time and say, okay, that's great. Now we want a dialogue, not a monologue. And so I'll say, okay, that's good. When you want to talk about that section, let me ask you the question about what advice you have for people in your situation. She's a female engineering in a male dominated industry. So, that would be, now she can just talk about that. And then I say, okay, let's talk about your college career, or blah, blah, how did that work? So understand their story when you can, and then help them understand that you're going to ask them a series of questions so you get a dialogue, not a monologue.
So Larry, I see you're moving a pivot to New York Times. I'm doing my show today at 9 a.m. And I do LinkedIn Live and YouTube live streams now. That's what I've moved to. We create a podcast on the back end and put it up on Podbean, and then it hits all the proper podcasting sites. But the guy I'm interviewing is a 6-time New York Times bestselling author. So if you want me to introduce you to him, Larry, I'm sure he'd be open. His name's Joe Garner. And,
yes. I would.
Okay.
So this is how I'm going to do it. You talk about how are you going to get guests. And we have an event on this on Friday about how to do this, and it's been really good at 11 o'clock Central Time. It's called connecting, not networking. Mm-hmm. So how do you use centers of influence? How do you tap into centers of influence? This is how you do it. So who do you know who shares your values? Who do you know that has common interest? Who do you know who's owns the pond, not in the pond, in the industry? So I talk to people all day long about this. Hey, Rick, who do you know in this area? But it's strategic because I'm ready. Like, I know I have value for that person. I won't do that unless I know I have significant value for them. So JD, go ahead, Stephen, and then JD's gonna
just to follow up on that for everyone. One of the things I found very successful is when I have somebody who, like an author, I will send them a link to a previous interview with an author. If I have an interview with the CEO, I'll send them a link to a previous interview I've done with the CEO, just so they see my style, the way I talk. And I just send them one link and gives them a opportunity to see it. and that helps to convince them often to join. So just a thought.
All right, perfect. JD picked out the perfect name for a podcast that he's starting. That seems important to me to have the right name. So I'll turn over to you.
Well, I have an interesting challenge in podcasting, and I'm really kind of overlaying this podcaster space on a couple of areas. The first is, yes, I've recorded shows. I haven't launched the podcast yet, so I've got a full season in the can that lives on YouTube. Name of the show is Two Deer in the Headlights. And my co-host, Sia Yasser-Tornrat down in Dallas, Texas, and I are basically just establishing ourselves as personalities. So in season 1, we had no guests. Really, JD? Why is that? Because what we're doing is we've got our chemistry and our rapport so well established, and we've shown a versatility across numerous topics. So now we're going to promote these shows to people who are serious about guesting on the show, who are good sports, who kind of know who we are. They're going to bring their own expertise, and it'll fall into what I would say is the template of the standard business podcast, because it plays for a business audience. But while that's percolating, I'm getting ready to launch a second podcast. Really, JD, a second podcast, which is going to be much more improvisational and free form. It's called Completely Unprepared with JD Gershbein. So my guests are, as you guessed, completely unprepared. And again, the goal is that I'm trying to break away from a lot of the formulaic podcast drivel that we tend to hear. And it's great to be on podcasts. It's great to guest on them. I looked over the pandemic, the last 18 months. I've guested on 60 podcasts, which sounds great, but I did a lot of them as a solid for friends. These folks are not broadcasters. They're really trying, and they're trying to get their name out there. And I wanted to do them a solid. But on the other hand, some were very good because I got to tell my story from a different angle. So one of the, and I'll kind of speed up here a little bit. One of the upsides of the whole podcast platform is that it gives you an almost limitless reservoir of content from which to draw to promote yourself for future guests. And as a guest, you want to get better and better and better. So when you approach a guy like Rick, who's doing this for real, who's in a radio network, this is the big leagues, folks. What Rick is doing is the big leagues. This isn't the place to go and crowdsource your story or trial and error. You're prepared. You're in front of an established listenership, and you're standing and delivering your value. Whereas on some of these podcasts, it's like the green room, it's the warm up, it's batting practice. So what I'm doing, which for those of you who want to guest on podcasts, is prepare your branding / marketing materials to approach a guy like Rick and say why you feel you'd be a good guest. And I come from the speaker world. So I'm basically taking the one sheet that I had as a speaker and moving that into the realm of podcast guest.
Yeah, that's perfect. So we've only got another minute, and I want to announce first, we're going to move this into a networking format. Anybody who wants to stay on, we'll go for another hour. We'll work into subgroups. If you want to come on for 15 minutes or stay on for 30 minutes, that's fine. Kind of meet each other in a small group format. Second, next week on Wednesday, Chris Colt is going to do a workshop on how to use a challenge format to build a pipeline that leads into whatever your offering is. So that's his expertise, movement marketing, he calls it. So developing communities through challenges. So we've heard him before months ago. He's going to do this now as a workshop. And then on Thursday, Ruben Schwartz has developed a CRM system for self-employed consultants. So he looked at Salesforce and all these other, what I would consider like totally inappropriate systems, HubSpot, these things don't really work very well for solo operators. So he's created a CRM to help manage the revenue side of the business. So he's going to talk about that on Thursday and how we did it as a software company. Thank you, Rick, for doing this. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Got a lot out of it. I think everybody did. You could tell from the questions, but I'm going back to this. Everybody here there's certain things I'm calling it a revenue operating system, which we're launching in September. It's a formal, like it's a whole series of videos and then people that can support each aspect of it. But this is in there. It's like, you got to be known, you know, you got to have your market niche. You got to be a thought leader in it. You got to have your market point of view. You have to have all your stories, and you have to have some vehicle to present your expertise to the right people. There's a lot of ways to do it, but we better all have this, you know, because it's getting crowded out there. So if you don't wake up and do this kind of stuff, you're not going to make it.
So thank you for the opportunity. It was fun to meet all these entrepreneurs. If anybody is using LinkedIn and you'd like to connect with me, I'm Ric Franzi. Would love to have a first level connection with you to watch kind of what you're doing and learn from what you're posting and maybe reshare your content to try to help the community with the flywheel. So Ric Franzi, LinkedIn, please reach out to me. I'll follow you back and we can build a relationship. So thank you, Larry. I appreciate the opportunity.
Sounds good. And if anybody knows a mid-market CEO in Southern California, send him Rick's way.
Love to have him as a guest. Take care.
All right. Sounds good. So we'll stay on. Anybody wants to leave, feel free. I'm going to turn off the recording here.